Hi, MS translators. It's that time of the day again, and that time is about 4:30 a.m. And we've just finished day 2 of MS Virtual 2020, this year's joint ACTRIMS meeting, which is being held entirely online. So today was a fantastic day of talks and touched upon a number of topics that I know you'll be really interested in. So I started the morning at a session on the gut CNS axis. So essentially talking about the connection between the gut and the nervous system, and also talking about the gut microbiome. So there was lots of interesting talks presented in this session, and we will be doing further summaries of a lot of these presentations going through, so I won't go into too much detail with them to start with, but one of the interesting points that was made during this session was just how significant gastrointestinal symptoms are for people living with MS. And the figures that were presented was that it's about 66% of people living with multiple sclerosis will experience some form of gastrointestinal dysfunction, and around 32% of people experienced gastrointestinal symptoms even before the onset of multiple sclerosis. One of the interesting studies that was presented that's given a bit of I guess, interesting insight into how the gut microbiome may be involved. It was using twins, and twins where one of the twins had multiple sclerosis and the other twin didn't. And they took stool samples from these twins and essentially transplanted them into mice. And what they found was that in the mice that received the stool samples from the twin with MS, they got EAE, the mouse version of MS, much more quickly and much more often than those who received it from the healthy twin. So indicating that there was something in that stool sample, and this is likely to do with the gut microbiome, that was leading to disease in the mice. So that's quite an interesting, unique study to hear about that may indicate part of the role here. One of the other really interesting studies that was talked about was to do with the fact that in multiple sclerosis they see increased gut intestinal permeability, essentially what you may hear of sometimes referred to as leaky gut. And in this study done in mice, again using an animal model, they found that when they treated the mice with vancomycin, which is an antibiotic, this led to an amelioration or an improvement in disease in these mice. And they went on and tried to investigate what the mechanism might be behind that, and they found that it certainly involved the microbiome, and they did a couple of studies that showed them that. And the main way it did it was that it improved the integrity of that gut barrier, so reduced the leakiness of it. And so there was talk around that as to how potentially that could be used into clinical trials in the future to see if there's a way this could be used as a potential novel treatment for multiple sclerosis. And they suggested that instead of actually using the antibiotic, what they would like to see is to identify those bacteria that are actually protective against the leaky gut, and see whether or not they can be used as a form of treatment. They did touch upon diet in this session as well, mostly in the Q&A, and they were asked about, if you were to discuss with people living with MS what the most appropriate diet is to be on, what would you recommend? And essentially everyone on the panel at this time agreed that there probably isn't enough evidence at the moment to suggest one overall diet that can be recommended. However, they did all recommend a diet that included lots of fruit and vegetables. Also in this in this session, they did talk as well about some studies that have indicated that the immune response that's directed against the nervous system, and the one that we know a lot about in multiple sclerosis, that there are actually antibodies directed against myelin that recognize nerves in the enteric nervous system, or the nervous system that controls the gastrointestinal tract. And so the researchers in this area were going to go on and see whether or not they could find any cross-reactivity or targets that those immune cells recognize that may come from components of food, to see whether or not that may be something that's triggering that immune response. Now, they did say in that talk as well that it was unclear what was being the first target. Was it the nerves of the gut, or was it the other nerves, and then the nerves of the gut were being targeted after that? The only other thing that was talked about in that session was that there was a bit of an overall discussion about differences that have been seen in the gut microbiome for people living with MS compared to healthy individuals. And there are certainly a number of studies that have looked into that. But what they commented on was the fact that there doesn't seem to be any consistent results. And so while some studies have found certain bacteria may be either found in higher numbers in people living with MS or in lower numbers, that doesn't seem to be able to be consistently replicated through all of these different studies. There are some studies that indicate that levels of certain bacteria in the gut may be associated with relapses, or certainly seem to link with that. However, at this stage, they certainly aren't at the point where they can see any sort of causal relationship there. They're not suggesting that the numbers of those bacteria are what causes the relapse. They don't have that evidence yet to suggest it. So that was a really fantastic session to start the day off, and one that I'm sure you will be interested in. We know that the gut microbiome is something that our community is very interested in, so we will be doing more coverage of that in more detail after the conference as well. The second session that I attended today, or tonight, I guess in Melbourne time, was on remyelination. So again, a topic that I know our community is really interested in. It was a really interesting talk first up in that session from Professor Robin Franklin from the University of Cambridge. And he talked a lot about how we know that we see over time that there is a decline or a decreased potential for people living with MS to repair their damaged myelin. And his belief for a long time has been that this is just part of the aging process, and aging needs to be a factor that's considered when we're thinking about remyelination therapies. However, he did make the point that the aging of the cells that are involved in remyelination can be reversible. And so his team were all behind the study that we've talked about quite a bit on MStranslate. We've done a summary of before that looked at fasting as a way of being able to reverse or slow that aging process. And they looked at fasting and also the diabetes drug metformin, and found that could improve myelin repair in mice models. So he talked about that as well. Excitingly, they also talked about a potential remyelination therapy that's finished phase 2 trials now, called Bexarotene, and the data of that phase 2 trial is going to be released in the late breaking session, which will be later in September. So we have another day of talks tomorrow, and then there is a late breaking session in just under 2 weeks, and that phase 2 clinical trial data of this potential remyelinating therapy will be presented in that. So we'll make sure that we do communicate that to you when it's made available. There was then a talk by Ari Green from the University of California, San Francisco, and he talked a lot about the importance of just designing trials around remyelination that were going to be successful, and also the fact that we need ways of being able to measure whether or not the remyelination has worked. So to have what we call biomarkers as a way of being able to effectively monitor those trials to see whether or not any of these therapies are working. So a really important topic, and it's important that those discussions are being had throughout the research community so that everyone's on the same page, and we're getting really clear goals as to what we should be aiming for in those trials to make sure if we do find that something's effective, everyone agrees that with the results and the outcomes that have been generated. We had another talk in that session that just went through a number of the different trials that are going on at the moment in terms of remyelination, and I won't go through each of those in this video, but I guess the important point to make here is that there is a lot of work going on in this field, and it was interesting to hear a number of the different targets that are being looked into and the stages that they're at. Again, we'll provide more information on that over the coming weeks. But it's fantastic, I guess, for the MS community to know that there is a lot of work and a lot of effort being put into looking at potential myelin repair therapies. The last session that I attended tonight was on symptomatic treatment and rehabilitation. So again, a topic that I think the community will be really interested in. And in particular, there were two talks at the start of that session that really focused on fatigue. And so there was a number of stats presented in those talks indicating how significant fatigue is for people living with MS. And it was both studies, both presenters quoted numbers in between sort of 40 to 50% of people living with MS report fatigue as being their most debilitating symptom that has the biggest impact on their quality of life. And around 80 to 90% of people living with MS experience and report fatigue as a symptom. So they talked about the fact that really at the moment there isn't any great therapies available to deal with MS fatigue, and part of that is that there is still a lack of understanding as to the causes and the mechanisms behind fatigue in people with multiple sclerosis. And so that's an area of interest at the moment to try and really understand what's causing the fatigue. But what did come up is that there are two areas that have shown promise. One is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and the other is exercise. Now the results have been mixed and varied in that space, but they have shown some promise. The second talk went through the results of a recent trial called Triumphant MS, where they looked at 3 different pharmaceutical agents that may be able to modify and improve fatigue in people living with multiple sclerosis. However, unfortunately, they found that none of those treatments worked any better than placebo at improving fatigue in the people living with MS that were included on the trial. They did also mention an upcoming trial called Combo MS that was looking at one of those pharmaceutical agents used in combination with CBT over the phone. So that's ongoing at the moment, and when the results of that are published, we will make sure that we make you aware of that as well. So again, while there was nothing groundbreaking or hugely positive coming out of that session, I think it's really important, and I made the point on Twitter as well, that it's fantastic to see that there is sessions and talks being devoted to symptoms and to a symptom like fatigue, because we know that it is one that has such a huge impact on the quality of life for people living with multiple sclerosis. So it's great that there is a focus being placed on it because it really does deserve and need our attention. So that's the end of day 2. Day 3 coming up tomorrow, and we'll do another one of these videos probably at about the same time tomorrow morning. But for now, I'm off to get a little bit of sleep. But if you've got any comments or questions, please do post them below the video, and I'll be happy to answer them. And I look forward to bringing you the highlights from day 3 tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.